Are we live? I think we're live now. We're just here in the shop behind our counter here. John's getting ready to start the homebrewing class, so Sam here behind the camera. I got a beer in hand. We're just going to be kind of a member of the audience over here. If anybody has questions on the stream, you can type them in and I'll read them off here.
Guys, thank you all very much for braving the cold weather and coming out. I'm John, this is Sam, and this is our shop, Burgrass Homebrew Supply. A lot of y'all have been in before, but I guess just kind of, for the sake of kind of seeing how we should gear it, how many of y'all have never brewed anything before? Okay, how many of y'all have done like maybe a couple stovetop batches, maybe grains, maybe not? And then I think that's everybody, right? Anybody have any other experiences?
We did meat.
Okay, so the fermentation side will basically be very familiar to you. It's actually funny how similar it all is. Beer, mead, wine, cider. If y'all haven't grabbed one of these, I'll hand them out to you if you just want to pass them around if you want to grab one.
Excuse me. I'm going to set you all down 1 second here. We'll be right back. Oops, I didn't mean to do that.
What's up, man?
You want one?
John, how do you take this out of front camera? Oh, there it is. I found it. I tapped it on accident. Guys, we'll be right back.
Wait. If you guys want to grab a little syllabus copy, this is kind of what we'll go over. But basically what we'll be talking about is how to brew beer at home. You don't have to know a thing coming into it, but if you've done a few, that might... Some people like to brew a few and then take the class, but basically what I'm trying to say is any question that comes into your mind will very much not be formal here. Just holler out if something doesn't make sense. That's the overall goal, is to have it kind of click in your brain to be like, I remember when I first got started, it's kind of like, oh, there's so much that you read and look at, and it seems very complicated. We're here to kind of make it not too complicated. If I didn't get anybody, I'll just set these over here and come up and grab one. If anybody runs out of beer, I think that's what we got left. So yeah, this is going to be called a process of brewing called partial mash brewing. So we're going to be using a few different ingredients. We're going to be using some barley, some barley malt extracts. We're going to be using some packaged hops, and then yeast. Combining those all over about 2 to 3 to maybe 4 hours, like the first time you do it. Process of combining all those things in a pot of basically boiling water, and kind of transforming it from its base elements into beer, or what you'll hear called wort, which is just kind of unfermented beer. At the end of the day, all this boils down to, no pun intended or whatever, all that this process entails is making a batch of barley tea. We're just going to be steeping grains to extract the sugars and all that good stuff, boiling it for an hour. Hey, what's going on, man? To add hop flavors and sterilize it and all that kind of good stuff, and then at the end of that process, cooling it down to around room temperature, dumping it over into a sanitized bucket, adding yeast, and trying to forget about it for 2 weeks or so. So that's all there really is to it. We'll get into more details kind of as we go through that process about how you do that, but at the end of the day, beer is a pretty simple thing. Any beer that you have, whether or not it's a light Pilsner style, or whether or not it's a Russian Imperial Stout, or a huge hoppy beer, whatever, those are all going to be made out of the 4 basic ingredients that we just mentioned, just different, roasts of grain, different types of hops in different amounts, different strains of yeast, which we'll kind of talk about more in a minute. But any style of beer, that's one of the nice things about brewing, it's always going to take the 4 basic same ingredients, and it's always going to follow the basic process that we're going to go through here to put it all together. So, you take the class, you go home, you brew an American Pilsner, everything goes great, you know how to make an Imperial Stout. It's the same exact process, so there's nothing new you have to learn along the way. So kind of, yeah, with all that being said, the kind of process that we're going through here is going to yield 5 gallons of beer. That's, about up to here on a bucket, and that turns into about 2 cases of beer. So, 45 to 50 12-ounce bottles at the end of this process. The work day or your brew day is going to, again, I'll say, 3 hours, 4 hours will probably be the first couple. You can get down to 2.5, 3 hours after you've done it a few times, learn how to kind of consolidate your steps and whatnot. The whole brewing period will be about 3 weeks. So it's about 3 hours of your work on brew day, and then just 3 weeks of kind of letting it sit around for the yeast to kind of do their magic. But with all that being said, let's kind of start looking at the ingredients, and then after that we'll look at how you kind of start putting them together. Again, 4 ingredients. The first ingredient is kind of the backbone. It's malted barley or malted grains of any variety. If you guys had a little bit of time to walk around, you can probably see all the different varieties that we have back there. They all start out exactly the same way. Barley is grown in a field just like any other cereal grain. Brees is a big company here in America that does it and does it quite well. But basically they just grow the barley plant right out of the ground. They harvest it at harvest time, and then essentially take the little kernels and spread them out over a huge, like the factories where they do it are like the size of football fields. But you'll hear you'll hear beer referred to as like a malt beverage, or like you'll hear malts referred to as like one of the ingredients. Malt is basically just grain that's been malted, and that's probably not a very useful definition. What malting is basically taking those grains out of the field, spreading them out, keeping them warm and moist under very controlled circumstances so they don't turn into plants and they don't turn into moldy seeds, but they just barely start to sprout. And then as soon as that happens, they dry them out, and then they will roast them, kind of almost like coffee. Very light roasts. Grains. This is like a Pilsner malt. Makes a Pilsner style of beer. It's super light, not heavy, very fluffy and bready and nice. You keep them in that kind of roasting or kilning process a little bit longer, and you kind of start to caramelize or brown some of the sugars that are in there. You can get things that look more like that. This is like a brown malt, so this will be used in brown ales or some red ales, things in that mid-range category. Really starts to taste more like toast and like warm honey bread, or those really nice mid-range flavors. Some caramel, toffee, brown sugar notes can come through sometimes. If you keep roasting them, they almost start to look more like coffee. You can take them to the point where you really start to char some of those sugars. And if you're into like porters or stouts or like any Belgian dark strong, like any of those darker beers, that's where all that flavor's coming from, is those charred, deep, burnt bread, like chocolate, coffee, awesome flavors. This is like a black patent malt. This is as dark as you can possibly get them before they like turn into charcoal or catch on fire. These taste really nice and light. This tastes like going into Waffle House at like 4 a.m. and like licking the bottom of the coffee pot. Really, really just tannic and rich and awesome. So, basically mixing those together in different combinations can kind of yield any color of beer, any type of body that you're looking to get out of it. And then it'll also determine how strong the beer is going to be in terms not only of body but of ABV, because in addition to all those flavors and colors, we're also going to be getting sugar from these grains. And sugar is basically yeast food. So while this ferments out, or while the yeast kind of sit around, like we said, let it sit for like 3 weeks, the yeast are eating up all that sugar and converting it, or metabolizing it and excreting or fermenting the sugar into alcohol and carbon dioxide, which is what's going to transform this hoppy barley tea that we make from wort, which is just what they call the unfermented product, into beer, which is what you guys are all drinking and enjoying right now. So that's barley. Second ingredient then is going to be hops, and hops are pretty cool. They're basically little green pine cone guys. These are some dried whole leaf hops. Still pretty aromatic. Again, they just grow right out of the ground. In most parts of the world, they're kind of considered weeds, but they've been domesticated and kind of cultivated to just give you all sorts of different aromas and flavors. Let's see if we can find a good one here.
He's actually the flower, correct?
Yeah, so basically the plant is a vine, which basically just means it's a vine, but instead of having like tendrils like ivy, it wraps around stuff and just goes up, 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 up. And then usually, you know, around here, like around the end of August or like kind of wherever you are, towards the end of the summer season, they put off these teeny little green, leafy looking pine cone things, and then right at the end of that season, they start to secrete resins and pollen and all that good stuff. That's what we're looking to kind of capture out of these things. That's why they're useful in beer. Hops do a few different things. You can probably see some of that powder up inside of these leaves here. And these, if you guys like IPAs or something, we can kind of pass those around. They smell, I love them. Those have been open for a little bit, so they're not as fresh, but still pretty dang on nice. Hops kind of give a few different, provide a few different like benefits to brewers. The first is that they kind of provide a balance. They kind of provide a balance against all the sugar that we're going to be extracting from this barley during the steeping process. If we were to kind of steep grains and pull that sugar out and then just ferment that over into a beer just kind of as is, even though we said those yeast are going to be eating up a lot of that sugar, so much of the sweetness is going to be left over that at the end of the process it almost tastes like just medicinally sweet, like almost cloyingly, like just tongue-curlingly sweet. So, you know, way, way, way back when, in brewing days of yore or whatever, people kind of started to figure out, hey, you know, if we're like boiling this pot of liquid, if we throw some like herbal aromatic kind of things into this pot, it'll temper that sweetness, and the finished product just ends up tasting a lot more smooth and a lot more pleasant to drink a couple of, which makes you feel more pleasant. If you kind of go back over the history, you know, you'll hear a thing called brewing or like brewing without hops. Hops are kind of a modern ingredient in terms of the entire history of brewing, but you know, throughout the years or centuries or millennia at this point, people have used pretty much anything and everything to throw into beer to kind of balance it out. Heather, you know, holly, anise, wormwood, spruce. In Scotland, they used to just like dump bog water in there just because it was like so peaty and like weird. So pretty much you name it. The first documented use of hops, they were kind of native to the like regions of Belgium, is what it looks like, or like northern France. And the monasteries kind of started figuring out, hey, if we throw these in there, like the beer not only tastes good, but they were making kind of strong beers that were designed to like age through the winter and like all that good stuff. It lasts longer. It didn't spoil. It didn't turn into like vinegary, sour, weird tasting stuff. And that's because unlike a lot of those other aromatic herbs that we talked about, hops, by virtue of this really like sticky, dank, like pollen that they produce, which is like basically called lupulin, is very acidic. So when you extract those smooth, bitter flavors, you also extract a lot of just acids that are produced by the plant. And what those will do is basically ward off bacteria and wild yeast. If you wanted to make vinegar, you could take a big batch of sugary tea and just like leave it out. Wild yeast and wild bacteria are going to find their way down in there and basically turn it into something that doesn't taste too good. Sometimes you'll hear like infected beers or whatnot. You'll hear like the foot flavor or like whatever. That kind of hops are good at preventing those wild strains. They work really well with the domesticated yeast strains. They don't have any problems with each other just because they've been used together for so long, and basically give you a longer shelf life on your beer and make it a lot less likely that it's going to go south on you. And then obviously the final thing that you can get out of hops is those great aromas. So again, that's even a more kind of modern thing that our palates have changed to really want that. I don't know who's a hophead in here, but like it's getting crazy these days. You can't get enough. It turns into like you need a bigger hit every time to taste buds to register those IBUs. I'm the same way. It's like you can't get enough. But yeah, those flavors and those aromas, those are also, you know, basically the aromatics of the plant that you're capturing. And it's kind of cool these days. Like, you know, they used to just be weeds and you'd harvest them, but people have started playing around with cross-pollinating different like strains or different species or families of hops. Citra is a really popular variety. If you've had like Zombie Dust or Citra Down, those are single hop Citra hop beers. Really grapefruity and nice. Simcoe is another variety, and like that just has the aroma of like a pine forest in Oregon. It's really dank, it's really sprucey, piney, anything and everything in between. Amarillo is another nice one. It's like sticking your face in a honeysuckle bush. So all those different aromatics just kind of depending on the strain of the hop that you use. So that's hops. The next ingredient, again, is kind of the magic ingredient, and that's yeast. Yeast are just a teeny little microbial dude that kind of lives inside of this, package. There's probably in excess of 100 billion yeast cells or yeast animals kind of hanging out. There are just as many in here as there are like all over and all up inside of me and like all of you and every surface in this room and like everywhere out in nature. Yeast are everywhere, and all that they want to do in their nice little lives is just to eat sugar and reproduce and excrete alcohol and carbon dioxide. That's just kind of what they do. So again, we can kind of go back to that thought experiment of just, maybe way back in pre-Mesopotamian, like Levant days or something. Some people were harvesting these wild grains from, the surrounding lands or whatever. Maybe somebody had a basket of them and, was walking home and then, saw a predatory cat or, a weird Neanderthal coming at them, dropped the grains and, ran away. Maybe it rained that night, they came back, and they were like, whoa! It had this foamy, weird layer sitting on top of it, and maybe it got dumped out quite a few times, but at some point somebody was probably hungry enough or just curious enough to be like, and then you start meeting the gods, basically, if you eat enough of it. And that's all very speculative, but basically, what was happening is those wild yeasts from everywhere, if those grains got wet and sat in that nice warm basket for a day or two, it's essentially doing what we're doing when we make a batch of beer. Wild yeast find their way down into that now sugary liquid. They start to eat up all those sugars and turn it into alcohol. If it was a weird wild yeast strain, like we kind of talked about a little bit ago, the Mesopotamian or the Sumerian might have come back and be like, oh no, that smells like my brother's feet, and just dumped the basket out and was like, And then if a different strain got in there, one that's kind of more works better with the human palate, maybe they were like, oh, this smells okay. We'll bring this back to the village or whatever. And kind of through that process, this is again what people speculate. There's no way to prove it, obviously, but the strains that worked well with what tasted good to whoever was living there got brought back to the village, inevitably, probably after you're slugging a few, pints of your Ninkasi brew or whatever. You start spilling it, it starts getting those wild yeast all over your hut, it starts getting the wild yeast everywhere. And kind of, essentially, I think of it as a very early example of domestication. The stuff that didn't really work with what the people wanted got left out in nature. The stuff that was appealing to what tasted good to them got brought back to the village and kind of used the people to continue to feed it and to work towards its advantage. So that's kind of why you see in different brewing regions throughout the world, each kind of community or monastery or wherever it is kind of gets their own little house strain of yeast that each kind of has its own unique flavor. Really old varieties, if you have ever had a Hefeweizen, those banana, clovey flavors that come through in those beers, there's no banana or cloves usually in those beers. That's kind of that unique flavor that particular strain of yeast produces. If you go to northern Germany, it was cooler climates, just kind of because of the environment, it favored lager yeasts, and it's what tasted good to them, and then in those climates you develop traditional beers that are more crisp and clean. Belgian beers are all over the map. There's all sorts of crazy, flavors of fruit and cloves, and horse blanket is a good term that gets tossed around. English ales tend to be very bready. That's just, again, very much a byproduct of that yeast strain that kind of started to get used over there. So eventually, people didn't really have a great handle on it, but eventually we kind of started to figure it out, what was actually going on here, that these wild guys were going in there and doing their job. It's cool nowadays because, thanks to the work going forward from Louis Pasteur and stuff like that, we can isolate in the laboratory what strains produce what flavors. We get a lot of our yeast from a company called White Labs, and they will actually go to monasteries in Belgium with CSI kits and swab the walls and then bring the samples back to the lab. And just because, like we said, those monks have been making that same beer in this building for centuries, I mean, they don't even have to add yeast into their beer when they are ready to ferment it. They just let it sit open, and there's nothing, the strain that they're looking for has long ago outcompeted anything else inside of the, you know, they could get in there and turn it weird. So that was kind of cool. But White Labs will isolate those strains, build them up in a lab. So today, like in our yeast fridge back there, we have cells that have kind of developed in their like home natural regions, and now we have access to pretty much like everything. So it's a good time to be a home brewer. That's probably enough said about yeast. We'll talk about it more when we're at the end of the brewing process here. The fourth and final ingredient is water. And water's kind of the medium where it all comes together and gets real happy. We're pretty fortunate here. You'll hear a lot of people, especially like online and stuff, asking about, you know, is my water okay to use? Should I do anything to my water? Here in Louisville, our water tastes pretty daggone good. It's about as good as nature can give you for fermentation too, just because, you know, just in the same way that limestone bed makes a really nice Kentucky bourbon, it also makes really daggone good beer. So I say for starting out, yeah, I use what comes right out of the tap. People win the state fair here every year with beer straight out of the tap, and people, you know, some of our homebrewers win competitions all over the country just with good old Louisville tap water. So, you know, if you get into it a little bit more, there are some really easy tweaks you can do if you want to kind of control that variable a little bit better. But if we're getting going, we'll talk a bit about sanitation and stuff like that at the end. Focus on that. The water's going to work great. So all that being said, those are the 4 basic ingredients. Now we'll kind of start looking at how you put them all together to make beer. First piece of equipment that you'll need, we talked about all the ingredients up front. I'll talk about the equipment kind of as we use it, just because I think it makes more sense like in context or whatever. But the first piece of equipment you want to get your hands on is a brew pot. And basically all that is just some kind of a big thing that'll fit nicely on your stove, or if you want to get crazy, you can get a big pot and take it out onto like a propane burner and, you know, fire away. But when you're getting going, just doing it on the stovetop is nice and easy. Something you can boil at least like 2.5 to 3 gallons in is going to work fine. This is one that I've done before, and it cuts it a little bit close, but I can get away with it. A 5-gallon pot makes it a lot easier, just because you don't have to worry about it boiling over and stuff like that. The first step to getting going is basically just to take your pot over to your sink and just collect about 3 gallons of water right out of your tap. So these are nice too, because they're kind of graduated. Bring that back over to your stove. Blast your heat. We're going to want to let this warm up to about 150 degrees. So it'll take a little bit of time. The second piece of equipment that you'll need, every piece of equipment that I talk about here too comes in what we call our like basic fermentation kit that we sell pretty much across the board. This should be in any like homebrew kit that you find online or anything like that. But yeah, if I use it, it comes in our kit basically. We try to put everything that you need in there to get going. So yeah, again, the next piece of equipment is a thermometer, and that's basically going to let you know when you've come up to about 150 degrees or so. So what you'll want to do is just, this is a nice one because it just kind of floats down inside of here. You can let it float down in your water, pull it up every once in a while, get a temperature reading on it. It'll take, you know, this thing is like 1800 watt, like induction thing. It'll take 20-30 minutes to heat up 3 gallons. If you're on a gas stove at home, it'll be quicker. Our old like stove that we had in college when we started brewing, that thing could barely do it. It took like an hour to get it to 150, but it was a piece of junk. But we still got the job done. It just took a little bit longer. So kind of let your stove do its job. Turn it all the way up to high. Let that heat up to about 150. And then when you're at 150, basically just adjust the kind of thermostat or the throttle on whatever you're using to heat it up, and just, you know, try to get it to hold right in that 150 to 155 degree range. And again, any like numbers or temperatures or times that we say, you don't have to worry about remembering it. It'll be laid out in this thing or in any recipe that you kind of, you know, take home and are working through.
Is there a heat setting on a stove that you found, like medium high?
Yeah, like medium to medium high tends to be like about the right to kind of hold it. I'd say medium is probably a pretty good bet. I'd say it's better to let it cool down a little bit than to get warmer. Yeah. Just, you know, start with medium and just kind of see how it does. Just watch it for 5 minutes and just make sure it's not moving around too much. That 155 degrees is kind of what we're looking for, because it's going to allow us to basically take our grains. These are whole kernel grains. Again, kind of like coffee, before we use them, before we like start steeping in or whatever, we run them through, you basically crush them up. We have our grain mill back there. You guys might have heard me using it a few minutes ago here. But that's going to turn the grains from their whole kernel form into just a like really nice kind of crushed up stuff where we can pull all that flavor out of there super, super easy. We compared it earlier to making tea, because the way we're going to get these sugars and nice flavors out of here, but not just basically have a pot of like weird barley floaty sludge, is to use a grain steeping bag or a muslin bag or just essentially a large tea bag. So we're going to take this guy here, dump our grains into it. It would have been easier if I'd made a bigger hole in this bag.
So you crush those up before you do that?
Yeah, so basically you want to, like, you know, one of the nice things about being able to kind of do it when we put our recipes and stuff together, we wait till the last minute to kind of build the grains for you. Kind of like, you know, kind of like coffee. The sooner you can kind of get them working, like after being crushed, the fresher those flavors are going to
Can you
be.
use a coffee grinder to grind those at home?
Yeah, it's kind of a pain in the butt just because, like, it'll take you a little while, but if you have a nice one, you definitely don't need to, like, turn them into, like, coffee grounds. If you just were in something like that, just a couple quick pulses. Our mill back there, if you want to take a look at it in a little bit, it's nice because it has, like, 2 steel rollers that are spaced a little bit apart. Ours actually has 3 steel rollers. But it'll, like, squish them, but it won't, like, shred them, which kind of keeps that husk intact so you don't get shredded, like, grain husking your beer or whatever. But yeah, just kind of cracking them open any way you can to get the flavors out. It's going to work fine. So, we'll take this here, tie a loose knot up towards the top. Try not to, like, you know, some people will tie it right down here and it just kind of keeps everything compact. The idea is to really let these things swim around, and that'll, again, just let us get all the flavors and stuff like that that we're looking for out of here. Let me put some water in this pot and I'll show you guys what it'll look like when we start steeping.
Hey, dude, could you hand me that beer right there? Thank you.
So, we'll take our grain bag, stick it down into our 150 degree water, and basically just kind of walk it around the pond. Give it a little bit of encouragement here. We're going to let these grains kind of do their thing for, you know, I'll say 30 minutes is probably a pretty good rule of thumb.
Walk around the pond for 30 minutes?
Just, yeah, kind of, you know, play with it. You don't have to sit here and work with it the whole time. Like, you can tell pretty quickly it starts to look pretty nice, especially with these, like, darker roasted grains. So you definitely don't have to, like, sit here and baby it the entire time, but spend the first 2 or 3 minutes with it, just really kind of working it around. Your kit will also come with, like, a long-handled spoon. You can kind of get down there and massage it a little bit, just jab at that bag. And then if you want to kind of just let the convection and the heat kind of do the work for you, after 2 or 3 minutes, it's totally fine. Just kind of let it do its thing. What you might want to do, is basically just kind of thread this through here and pull that bag a little bit up off the bottom, just so it doesn't scorch. If you want to kind of keep it sturdy, you can just kind of do a loose little knot up here. And then, you know, come by every couple minutes and just kind of work it a little bit, move it around. But 20 minutes, basically what will happen, that hot water starts going inside of there and dissolving. You know, a kernel of grain is essentially just a little starch ball. when it comes off the plant, that malting process that we talked about, when the plant starts to grow, what that does is just through the miracle of life, it starts to break that starch down into smaller molecules. The ones that we're really interested in are carbohydrates and, you know, smaller chunks of starch. But also inside of there, you're going to get some enzymes, and that's kind of what's going to work to break down those starchy molecules into smaller molecules, which we call sugars, which are going to be fermentable by the yeast. So the heat and the liquid, it's kind of all happening inside of here. The heat catalyzes those enzymes, and you can kind of think about it like if this is like a starch molecule, it's really long and wonky or whatever. Enzymes are these kind of little magic little, it's obviously a rough analogy, but kind of like key-shaped molecules that'll kind of find the right little hole. Maybe you can even think about them like something like this. They find the right little thing, and then they can just pop these things apart. So then instead of having one long starchy molecule that's too big to like fit inside of yeast's mouth, you have smaller stuff that yeast can eat and turn into alcohol and CO2, like at the end of that process, and extract the energy they need to live. So life is a miraculous. Life finds a way. But it's pretty cool.
Does the yeast just get discarded when you're
Like at the end of the brewing process? There's a lot of things you can do with it. Yeah. So you know, I tend to add like fresh yeast every time that I brew, but a lot of people, when you get into it, I had some around here, but I think I got rid of it. Basically, like when we're done fermenting, you're going to have all that leftover yeast, like big sludgy layer, they call it trub or lees, in the bottom of your fermenting bucket.
Yep.
Some people will basically take that, harvest it into like a flask or something like that, and then you can feed it a little bit of extra sugar and essentially kind of culture or cultivate like your own yeast at home. Kind of keeping the strains, you know, that you really like, and they design these things, like White Lab says with some of their strains, they're best if you let them kind of build up for 6 or 7 generations. They really just kind of start to get hardy and really like efficient at fermenting and stuff like that.
Have you brewed that way and noticed the difference with reusing the yeast over time?
Nah.
No.
White Labs is really nice because they're so consistent, and they kind of do that same work for you. Like they just are always keeping that like propagated yeast super healthy and happy and all that good stuff. I did have a buddy, his name is Rob, and his grandpa owned like a farm somewhere in like outside of Elizabethtown or something. But he took a bunch of little 1-gallon buckets. He brewed beer, and then he took a bunch of little buckets of it, like 1 gallon, and he put one like outside the barn. He put one like underneath the apple trees. He put one like by the pond or something, and just kind of like we were talking about earlier, just let nature take its course. And he said like 4 of them just tasted like sour, like rotten garbage or whatever. But one of them actually tasted really nice, and it was really like straw flavored and kind of like apple estery. So he actually kind of harvested his own yeast out of nature, and he called it like his Rob strain or whatever, or his farmhouse strain because he got it out of his grandpa's farm. So yeah, you can definitely like experiment with stuff like that, but you don't have to worry about it because like the science behind it is so good these days. It's really easy to get really consistent results, but it's fun to fool around with. So that's definitely something we can talk about, like, you know, as you go down the line.
So you're literally doing this process, and he poured it in 5 1-gallon buckets.
Yeah, and just
And
spread
set it
around.
out
Yeah,
covered where
open to nature. Yeah, and just let the whatever found its way in there find its
and
way
then
in.
after 2 weeks, pull the buckets, strain them out, and drink it.
I think yeah. So I mean, he just kind of came back to him and like kind of like we were talking about earlier. It was like,
oh, okay. Yeah. Stinks. Yeah.
then one tasted pretty good. He said it just tasted like I can't remember if I ever got to try anything he made with it, but he said it just tastes like a really nice farmhouse ale, or like a saison if you have ever had like that style of beer. It was kind of in that family or whatever. So and that's kind of a more wild strain, so that makes sense. That's what he might have found. A lot of winemakers will make like they'll call it wild winemaking, and instead of like adding a fresh pitch of yeast, they'll just use the natural yeast off the skin of the fruit, just because like a lot of the times you know what's growing on a particular, like the apple stems always have like a really particular strain of yeast on them, so if you throw the apples in there, you kind of know what you're going to get. There's still a little bit of risk, obviously, but sour beers are relying on that contamination, essentially. You just want to hope that you get the good bad guys, like instead of the stuff that makes it taste like toe jam or like vinegar or whatever. or scabby band-aids is a good like flavor descriptor that gets tossed around. So we've been kind of letting this thing do its thing. 20 minutes have elapsed in our like Food Network style thing here. We'll pull these guys back out of here. Give them one more walk around. And then I like to give them a good long time to kind of drain back into here. Just lovely looking liquid coming out. You'll always read not to squeeze the bag, but that's bullshit. You can give it a nice gentle squeeze. Get the good stuff.
How long have you been doing this?
Like 15 years. We started when we were too young to buy it. And me and my brother Sam, we'd always kind of made wine with my dad when we were kids. So yeah, we were down in college and like, man, we wish we could buy some beer. And then it's like, I think we saw an episode of Good Eats where Alton Brown made a batch of beer, and we're like, I bet we could do that. So stole a carboy from my dad's winemaking supplies in the basement, and then bought a little kit from Liquor Barn of like, because you can buy all the ingredients, you don't have to be 21 or anything to like buy and we thought we were really getting away with something. I think we made like a German alt beer, was like our first one we did. But it was fun, yeah, kept doing it.
And what kind of beer is this? What kind of grains did you make there?
This would be like a brown ale.
Okay.
We're just kind of winging it. Yeah, so we extracted all the sugar and all the flavor and all the good stuff from those grains. I'm definitely going to keep you guys here longer than an hour. I'll try to speed this up. But keep asking questions. This is the good stuff. Next step is to now bring it all up to a boil. Heat goes back onto high. Let it do its thing. It'll take, again, a little bit of time to go from 150 or so up to that boiling point. But, you know, just kind of zen out, do whatever, drink a few beers. It's a little bit frustrating. The old colloquial saying or whatever that a washed pot never boils. The brewer's corollary to that is that an unwashed pot will always boil over. Our old shitty college stove can attest to that. We definitely did not get our security deposit back on that apartment. Basically what's happening here is this stuff kind of starts to heat up. It's going to get really close to boiling, and then it's going to produce a little layer of foam right on top. We won't get too technical, but it's like plant protein denaturing inside of here, kind of going from being like a small little, kind of like cooking an egg. Basically, when you heat it up, it just solidifies. What that looks like in beer is just a little layer of foam that then, kind of like a marshmallow in the microwave, can really quickly just start to grow on you. You kind of want to let it do that. Those proteins all kind of do their thing and then just become part of the beer that'll later settle out. But you don't want it to happen, again, all over your stovetop. So when it's heating up, you know, be on your computer or like look at cat videos on your smartphone or whatever, but keep an eye, like keep one corner of your eye on this thing just so it doesn't get away from you. At some point, before you reach a boil, I usually like to let it heat up, you know, pretty close to boiling. You're going to mix in your extra malt sugar, and essentially this is a really thick, like molasses on steroids, like sweet barley sugar concentrate. So essentially it's what we've made here boiled down. If we were going to make a 5-gallon batch, like even if it was like 5% beer out of just grain, instead of needing like, this is probably about 2 pounds or something, we would need about 10 pounds, which, you know, you need like a bigger like pot and special equipment for and stuff like that. So doing it on your stove, they basically take 8 pounds or so of that grain, do exactly what we're doing here, boil it down until it's something that resembles like, you know, a molasses or like a really thick syrupy liquid, which we can then rehydrate by just stirring it back into our beer, getting all that malt sugar. If you make a beer out of just extracts, that, you know, that process can make it taste kind of processed, or just can kind of take away that kind of fresh coffee, like nice fresh flavor that we were talking about from freshly milling the grains. So adding a big old dose of steeping grains and then using the malt extracts to basically get the ABV where you want it. Again, people win the state fair with beers, like people get frustrated, like the old brewing fogies are like, why did that beer win? Like, it was extract. It makes great beer. So if you hear anybody poo-pooing on extract beer, tell them to fuck off. So this is getting pretty close to a boil. I'm basically going to take my cans of extract here, rip off, stir them in. As we said, this stuff is super freaking thick, so when it starts going into here, it's going to go boom, and it's going to sink right down to the bottom of this pot. So just make sure you give it a good stir while this is happening. I'll often even just get a pretty good little whirlpool going, and then just kind of pour it in slowly into that whirlpool, just getting my spoon, breaking it all up as it goes in. And number one, usually in a recipe like this, you'll see 2 cans of extract to use. There's also a thing called dry malt extract, which is the powdered version of this. So we tend to use that a little more just because it's a little easier to work with.
Kinds of extract, like, and they produce different flavors.
Yes, exactly right. So there's different. Just like there's basically, like we said, this is just a boiled down version of this. Same kind of thing. When they're back in the malt making, syrup making plant or whatever, they're starting out with different grains. So there's, like we said, there's Pilsner malts that make super light body beers. There's Pilsner malt extracts, which make super light beers. We have like pale malt, which is kind of in the middle. Then it goes down to like amber and then dark. We get one that's from like English malts. It's called like Maris Otter, like the fancy one. And you know, there's a few more like rye malt, stuff like that. So yeah, there's absolutely different varieties. Just kind of starting out from different ingredients to be able to get the style of beer that you want to hit.
So you said you use powdered?
Yeah, there's also just a powdered version. It basically just looks like this. So same idea. It's just a bag of like sugary stuff instead of a liquid. We tend to use this stuff a little bit more often. There's really no flavor difference.
You don't find it clump when you're dumping it in?
I find that it does clump, but that means it floats on top and it doesn't like sink down to the bottom where I can't see it. So I'd rather like see it clumping up here than see it clumping up, not being able to see it clump up on the bottom. But some people really prefer liquid, and there's definitely a lot more varieties of liquid available. So it doesn't really matter, just whatever you find easiest. Some people have strong preferences either way. I really don't. I think it's,
stir some of that, like take some out and stir it like a slurry.
that would work too. Whatever works best for you. Get it in there. There's no wrong way to do it. It's really just whatever makes it the easiest for you. But yeah, that's kind of like making a brew or something. Yeah, mixing that stuff in first so it doesn't clump up. But especially if you have like a little slotted spoon or something, it'll clump, and it's pretty easy to break it up. Especially when it's like getting really close to boiling. So that probably kicks down my temperature a little bit. We'll wait a little bit longer for it to come back up to a boil. You'll know it's really close to boiling because you'll start to see that foam coming up. If it does come so close to the top of your pot, which it probably will at some point, all you have to do to kind of keep it from going everywhere, if you're on gas, it's super easy. Just turn off that heat source. As soon as the heat's gone, it'll sink right back down immediately. If you're on an electric, you might just slide it off or just lift it up for a second. Same thing. Just as soon as it's off that heat, it'll settle back down. Put it back on the heat. Give it a couple more minutes. That foam will probably come up maybe 1 or 2 more times, but just kind of repeat that basic thing until you reach a nice, doesn't have to be a super hard boil, but just basically until you reach a boil or like a simmer. And then you know that you're ready to move on to the next step, which is boiling it and adding the flavors, adding the hops throughout the boil. So I think we're on step 6 here. Oops. I got that later, man. It's totally fine. It's kind of arbitrary when you decide to move on to step 6, but basically what we're going to be doing, one way or another, is just letting this have a nice, steady boil going for 1 hour. So basically just kind of whenever you feel like that foam has subsided, whenever you're comfortable that you can, turn your back for a few minutes and it's not going to turn into, again, keep your eye on it, but as soon as it doesn't seem like it's just blowing up, going everywhere, look at the time, or like set a little timer for 1 hour, and then kind of refer to your recipe, and next to step 6 over here, or whatever recipe you're using, it'll tell you what to do throughout that 1 hour boil to add the flavors that you want to add into your beer. So on this one that you guys have, this is a pretty simple one. The recipe for this was based off, I think it was a German Oktoberfest, so not a hoppy beer whatsoever. There's 2 ounces of just kind of traditional, nice German hops going in there, again, to cut the sweetness of that malt and to give it a nice little, aroma, but you're really not even going to probably notice it over the abundance of malt that comes through in a beer like that. So for this one, I would just kind of read my recipe here, and it tells me to add 1 ounce of Tettnang hops, and then off to the side in parentheses it says 60. Whatever number's off to the side or how many minutes are left in that 1 hour, when I throw that ingredient into the mix. So basically I would hunt through my recipe kit, I would find my tetning hops. When there's 60 minutes left on that timer, or kind of arbitrarily, whenever I decide I'm ready to start timing it, I'll rip them open, dump them into that boil, and that's all there is to that. I'll look at my recipe again, and it'll tell me to add 1 more ounce of, this time, Hallertau hops, which is just another old school German variety, when there's 20 minutes left. So I really don't have anything to do for 40 minutes. I'll just kind of hang out, look at some more like cat videos, keep like one eye on this thing, drink a few more beers. When there's 20 minutes left in my timer, I'll find my ounce of Hallertau, rip them open, dump, done. And that's all there is to that 1 hour boiling process. Essentially you are just kind of standing around watching a pot boil, but it's cooler because you're watching a beer brew. And it smells amazing when it's going on. Unless you're my girlfriend and she says, "You're making that beer stuff again?" She doesn't actually talk like that. She's very nice. Sorry, hope you're not watching. So, you know, that would be an example of a not very hoppy beer. And for anything that's not super hoppy, it's going to look pretty similar to that. Again, if you are a hophead, like we said earlier, if you're making an IPA, nothing's going to change in terms of any of these steps that we're taking. But when you get to this boiling stage, there's just going to be a lot more instructions inside of this little block off to the side. So this is our double IPA that we actually just kegged up today. We call it our Higher Horse IPA. But this one tells you when there's 60 minutes left, we had 2 ounces of cluster, which is just a nice American variety of hop. Add 2 ounces of cluster. And then when there's 20 minutes left, we had 1 ounce of Centennial, which I think Bell's Two Hearted. That's like all Centennial hops. Just a nice, really West Coast style hop. When there's 10 minutes left, we had an ounce of Columbus, which is just another variety. When there's 1 ounce, or when it hits 0, then we throw in 1 ounce of Simcoe, 1 ounce of Citra, and 1 ounce of Denali hops. So a lot more stuff going in, but it still follows that exact same pattern, or that exact same logic. All you have to do is basically read your recipe, throw in what it tells you to throw in, at what amount, at what time.
But it's always boiled for an hour?
Yeah, and there's some beers that like will go a little bit longer. Like if you ever had Dogfish 90-minute IPA, they call it 90-minute because it's a 90-minute boil. They just boil it a little bit longer. A, to kind of force some caramelization of some of that sugar, and then B, to like get even more intense bitterness out of those hops. 120-minute IPA, they just kind of kick it up another notch. They boil it for basically 2 hours just to pull all the, like, every single last little bit of bitterness and flavor out of those ingredients. But 98% of stuff is just 60 minutes.
The longer you boil the hops, the more bitter. So like the 60, when you put it in a 60, you're going to pull as much bitterness. And when you put it in a 0, you're basically just getting aroma, right?
Exactly right, and that's a really good point to make. So if we're making this huge IPA, like why don't we just take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 ounces of hops, just throw them in there at the beginning and get all that flavor out. It's kind of because, those bitter flavors are kind of tough to get out. It's a process called isomerization, but basically it just means like what you have to do to a certain molecule in order to make it become soluble, or in order to make it be able to like dissolve into a liquid to become part of the beer rather than something just floating in it. So to kind of bond or like capture those bitter particles, you really have to boil it for at least like 30 minutes before those are really going to start to efficiently be isomerized or whatever. So the stuff that goes in right towards the beginning of the boil, you'll hear it called like the bittering hops. And that's kind of what we're looking to get out of those. On the other hand, and you'll probably notice this when you're brewing, as soon as you throw those hops into this liquid, you're going to get a huge, like, you're going to smell what those hops taste like. It's going to start rolling off there in an amazing way. But the fact that you're smelling it means those flavors are leaving this beer. Those flavors are so delicate that, like, they'll be extracted and they'll bond pretty quickly, but after they've been boiling for like 20 minutes, most of those aromatics are gone, and you start to get more of the bitter flavors kind of coming out. So staggering those additions, like adding some at the beginning, some in the middle, and then for hoppy beers, a lot at the end, kind of lets you get all the different flavors that you're looking to get out of them, and into your beer.
And you can also dry hop, which is just only for aroma.
And even like we're gonna, the next step actually is going to be getting us ready to add our yeast in here, and the yeast are going to kind of be moving around, working. You'll hear it called a kreuzen, but they're going to throw up a really like little foamy, weird layer. Even that activity produces enough volatility to drive off some of those really delicate aromatics that like typified a really good IPA.
Right.
So you come back after fermentation, sprinkle a few more hops into the mix, let it sit for another week or so, and then really capture those mostly aromatic
Yeah, it's
qualities.
just for aroma.
Yep.
So, if I'm understanding you correctly, like, if you want a more aromatic beer, you're going to put more of the hops in later.
Exactly right.
All
Like
right.
those, the new, Haze Cranes beers or whatever, those like New England style IPAs.
Yeah.
Our recipe that we use for that, nothing goes in, no hops go in until that timer goes off. Nothing goes in during the boil, and then you add a retard, it's stupid how many hops go in there right at the end. It's just annoying, because it just turns into sludge, but man, does it taste nice. And you get all the aromatics, but almost none of the bitterness, which is why those taste kind of like a mimosa. It's like, just really light and fluffy and tasty. And then you do a huge dry hop addition too, so you come back after the fact and add an even more ridiculous amount of hops into it. So, yeah, those are fun. So we boiled it for an hour. We followed whatever steps our recipe has told us to follow. When we're getting close to hearing ding on that timer, maybe I have this little 40-minute window here where I'm not doing much, and then I add my final addition, I have 20 more minutes to kill. I was trying to think ahead a little bit as to what we're going to be doing after we hear ding and after I turn off the heat here. If you take anything away from this class, like everything we've talked about so far, pretty freaking easy. People kind of ask, what's the most important thing to think about, or how can I make sure my beer's good? And the answer is always sanitation. So we kind of talked about wild yeast, wild bacteria that can make nasty flavors and stuff that we don't want our beer to taste like. Now is kind of when we're going to want to start thinking about those guys and start to kind of, understand our enemy or whatnot. Right now, I'm looking at a boiling pot of liquid. If we're thinking about sterile and sanitary, a boiling pot of liquid is about as sterile and sanitary a thing as you can get. This thing is just basically nuked anything that's inside of there. Our goal is to basically keep it that way. Just like it's going to kill any wild yeast or wild bacteria that might go down in there, it's also going to kill our yeast if we put them in there while it's this hot. So kind of the two things that we're going to think about as we near the end of our brewing process are how to get this, how to A, keep this sanitary, and then B, how to get this cooled down to a temperature where our yeast are going to be able to start going nuts and making all that, fermenting for us without letting anybody else get there first. So all that really means is thinking about temperature control, thinking about sanitation. If you think ahead a little bit, it's going to be super, super easy. Maybe when I have 10 minutes left in my boil, I'll find the lid for my pot, and I'll just kind of set it on the side here, like that, kind of vented. The steam is going to bellow up underneath this thing and very quickly sterilize the underside of that pot. When I have maybe 5 minutes left, just flip it around, let the other side get nice and steamy and sterilized. When there's 10 seconds left, just push that bad boy closed. All that steam bellows up inside of there, and basically we've created a little clean room here. We'll call this one clean room A. Ding on the timer. Heat goes off. We've basically still got a boiling pot of liquid here, and what we're going to do to kind of get it ready to transfer over here and add our yeast is to try to cool this thing down. You can just let it sit out at room temperature and it'll cool down to about 70 degrees, but it'll probably take close to 20 hours. It takes a really, really long time. So to accelerate that process, all you need to do is basically bring it over to your kitchen sink, plop it down in there, fill it up with maybe 3 or 4 inches of water beforehand, and then just right now, the water coming out of the tap is going to do a great job. If it's the middle of the summer, you might buy a big bag of ice or something like that to have with you too. But basically just create a heat differential. Create really cold outside, really hot inside, and that cold is just going to suck the heat through this nice conducting metal. It's going to let the heat escape, but it's not going to let anything in. We're going to keep that environment kind of sealed and protected from the outside evil influences of wild yeast and bacteria.
So don't stick it outside, just do the kitchen sink.
You can stick it outside, especially if it's snowy. We did a beer one, it was a couple years ago in that big snowstorm. We just plopped it down in the snow for a little while and went and drank a few more beers, and it cooled down in 40 minutes or something like that. So whatever you can do to kind of accelerate that process. But that running water is really nice just because it kind of draws the heat out to have a little bit of stuff moving around it. It all stays cool and nice. especially on a day like today, you should be able to drop it down to, they call it pitching temperature. The temperature that we're looking to hit is about 70 degrees. 20 or 30 minutes is usually a good amount of time if you have a big bag of ice or if the groundwater's freaking almost ice coming out of the tap. In the meantime, kind of while that's in my kitchen sink, chilling, I'll start to think about, we said this was clean room A. I'll start to think about preparing clean room B. And this is our fermenting bucket. It's called an ale pail. This is basically where this is now wort. It's just an unfermented beer. This is where the wort is going to commingle with the yeast and basically ferment, turn into beer over the next couple weeks. Clean room A is ready to go. We used heat to very efficiently produce that one. It's not really practical to use heat to sterilize a plastic bucket, but another nice advent of modern brewing. We used to have to use bleach back in the day, and we had some bleachy beers. But modern products are great. This is a chemical sanitizer, so basically phosphoric acid is the active ingredient in this one. Using an acidity, we're going to basically sterilize or sanitize the inside of this bucket with a solution of this stuff. This is nice. 1 ounce goes into 5 gallons of water. So I'll fill this up with like 5 gallons of warm water, or an ounce of my star sand, and then it's totally fine. I've been in and out of it all day, every day, for years. So just kind of stir that around, mix it up real good, and then just kind of give your pot a once over. Actually, I have some mixed up right here. So, just a nice kind of, soapy looking liquid. Just kind of run it around the pot. Get on every surface. Pardon me.
No, it's alright.
We'll also, very soon, be needing a lid for our bucket, so you can just go ahead and take that lid right now, shove it down inside of your sanitizer there.
Are all sanitizers the same?
They all basically do the same job, but they're definitely not all created exactly equal. There's also like powdered sanitizers. You'll hear this called like Easy Clean or Be Bright or One Step. Different brand names for essentially the same product, but this is a tablespoon per gallon of water. Also a great product. So there's an iodine, Iostar, or like iodine sanitizers. Or a lot of
sanitizers that you like use in like kitchens and stuff like
yeah, and they're all food grade. That's the nice thing about these new products is you don't have to go back and rinse them afterwards. I really like Star Sand. Phosphoric acid is the active ingredient in that one, and it's like not only is it biodegradable, but yeast can kind of munch. It breaks down when it gets in contact with like biological molecules or whatever. So anything that's like left over when it goes in, when your beer goes in there, that breaks it down. It actually breaks down into like a yeast nutrient. So your yeast will munch on those nice little residuals and kind of help them ferment that beer out, and they'll just bubble out your airlock.
When you put it in the bucket and it begins the fermentation, how do you prevent it from blowing up and fermenting too much? And
For sure.
Popping off.
So yeah, that's going to be basically. I'll talk about that in a little bit more in depth here in just a second. But you can see this little hole drilled in the top of the bucket.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to let the gases escape out of here. And instead of just letting that sit open like that, we're going to use a fun little tool called an airlock, or you'll hear it called a bubbler. Because if we fill this up with sanitizer, or any liquid, you can use vodka if you're in a pinch. Basically what will happen, I'll just embarrass myself here a little bit, but like, it'll let the gases come up through that liquid layer and bubble out, but that sanitizer keeps it isolated from the outside environment, so no nasties can find their way down inside. They'll get killed when they come in contact with that.
Oh, and
So-
the sanitizer won't go back down into the
Exactly right. So it'll just be able to bubble and degas. Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. We'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second, but that's probably all that really needs to be said about it. If you're going to have an airlock in use here in a little bit, you might just go ahead and, or you might as well rather, just go ahead and throw it down in your sanitizer. So that's kind of soaking, doing its thing. This stuff is very quick to produce a sterile environment. I'd say 2 or 3 minutes is perfectly sufficient. In the meantime, we're coming back over to our pot here. It's feeling pretty cool. You can be precise if you just kind of want to wing it. It doesn't have to be exactly 70 degrees. 70 degrees basically feels like if you push your hands into the pot and you don't feel any heat coming out, that's close enough to go on. If you're thinking, man, that seems stupid, I'd like to be a little bit more precise, then your head is in the right place. But hopefully this is going to set off alarm bells for y'all. You don't just want to like pick up stuff and start sticking it in here. If you do want to get a temperature reading on it, just take your thermometer, give it a couple minutes down in that sanitizer, and then if you want to see what your temperature is, pull this guy out. If I'm at anything that's going to go near this pot, in other words, after that bowl is done, stick it down your sanitizer first. That even includes your hands. So.
Can the water get too cold?
Yeah, I accidentally chilled mine down to like 50 degrees the other day because the water was so cold. All I did then was just give it a little bit of time to warm back up. It'll warm back up a lot quicker than it'll take to like cool it down. So you just let it sit for an hour and it should warm up a few degrees. So yeah, if you want to get a temperature reading, then the nice thing with a floating thermometer too is you can just kind of let it stay down in there, and then like as long as you're just kind of careful and you're not like doing that kind of stuff, that this is totally fine to be able to just kind of come look at it and go in and out, as long as anything that's going to come near this bucket goes into that bucket first for a good minute or so. So let's see where we are. 70 degrees, perfect. Next step, and really final step on brew day, is to just transfer our cool wort from clean room A down into clean room B.
How paranoid should you be during that transfer?
If you were going to pick one thing to be anal about, pick sanitation. But that being said,
say you did everything that you just said. I mean, what are the chances of the transfer causing weird stuff to get in there?
And then when would you know? Like, if you contaminated it, when would you know?
usually you don't really know until you taste it, unless it just starts like. Even sometimes they smell weird anyway. But if you just kind of like are 50% more anal than like a reasonable person would be just about sticking stuff in this sanitizer, Star San is a great product, and it's, I mean, frankly, considering how like the odds, I guess, hypothetically, we get very, very few infections.
I get that, but isn't there any airborne thing that you can sanitize against that could get in there as you're transferring from
100%, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
So it's
that's
definitely
a
not
low
a zero.
percentage?
It's hard to put a percentage on it, but you know, I guess based on our anecdotal reports, what would you say, Sam? Less than like 1%?
It's a tough thing to measure too, because how do you know all the factors
exactly.
of what happened?
Very, very low. Like
If you do all that, you're covered.
Yeah.
Most.
I'm gonna say like 1 to 5%.
Okay.
Obviously, it depends a lot on like your practices and stuff like that. But if you make sure everything touches this stuff for a good minute, obviously not zero, but pretty daggone close.
I think the other like good idea is that you're pitching like 100 billion yeast cells.
Yeah.
So there's
really,
just like
really
so much like yeast bacteria in there that other stuff, you give that a harder chance of actually taking off. Yeah, it gets out competed.
So let me actually use the bucket we're going to use here. You can ignore this step.
Can you reuse the sanitizer?
Yeah. As long as it like doesn't look like milk, it's usually still good to go.
Probably not something cheap.
It's pretty cheap. It's probably always better to err on the side of like fresh stuff, but I'd say it's in a week, or even if you like put a lid on it and keep air. Oxygen is what'll break that stuff down, the active ingredient, or any kind of bio material, but oxygen is obviously the most prevalent. That's what'll break it down. If you keep it oxygen free, like up to 6 weeks, like if you put it in a little spray bottle or something, but if it's more than a week old, I usually just make fresh stuff. Or if I stick my hand down in it and I can't see my hand under a few inches of it, I'll usually make fresh stuff. So clean room B has been sitting down here while that stuff's been chilling. It is ready to go, but it's full of sanitizer. So to prep it, I'll stick my lid one more time, and then I'll put my lid downside face up into the other bucket that comes with your fermentation kit, the one with the spigot on the bottom. We're not really going to use this one. This is going to be used about 2 weeks from now when we bottle the beer, hence the name bottling bucket. But today it's just going to hold my sanitizer. So I'll put that lid in there with the underside facing me. I'll give this one more rinse for good measure. And then I'll pour it over the underside of that bucket lid, so that gets a good last little bit of contact. Don't do this over your nicest rug. And then as I get close to the end and it gets easier to manage, I'll just start rotating the bucket around. So everything just gets a last little bit of contact with that sanitizing solution. There goes my airlock, which we'll fish out here in a second. Clean room B. Standing by.
You gonna dry that off?
And ready to go. That's the nice thing about these products is you can kind of let it be. The motto of Star San is don't fear the foam. And actually, you know, I used to always fear the foam, but then I got wiser. If you see that foam there, you know there's no bacteria there. So basically, as this stuff kind of clings on, it's just keeping that surface super, super sterile. So don't let there be like standing liquid or anything like that, but that is actually working in your favor. And again,
So
it'll
if that
break
gets
down.
into your board, it's not gonna.
Nope.
No.
Like one of the advertisements that they used to do back in the day was like the CEO of the company had like a pint glass full of Star San and like downed it, which I don't think is good for you. But he didn't. It didn't seem like he went to the ER. So all we have to do now is transfer. And again, do not do this over your nicest rug or like near your wife's purse. But we'll shove our lid back down into our sanitizer for a second here. So this is ready to go. Take our lid off of here, and we'll get our thermometer out. And then we're literally just going to pour it over. I guess we'll just wax on this for like a little bit here before we reach the end of this stage. But essentially what we've created here, again, it's wort, but what it is kind of a little utopia, kind of a little Garden of Eden for these yeast to go hang out in. They have access to a ridiculous amount of their favorite food, which is barley sugar. There's also like a few little like trace minerals and vitamins and stuff like that inside of the barley that also kind of helps their metabolism along. We've added some natural defense against their competition in nature, not only by adding hops in there to kind of ward those things off, but then also by literally like nuking their environment, by killing anything else that they would have to compete with inside of here. And then beyond that, we've even like temperature controlled it for them, so it's exactly the temperature where they want to hang out and do their thing. The one thing that they're going to need that we've kind of taken away from them during that hour of boiling is access to oxygen. They need oxygen to kind of reproduce and like essentially get ready to start fermenting this stuff out. When you transfer it over, is a super good time to very, very simply mix the oxygen back into the mix. All that it requires is that you get a little bit messy. So what that means is I'm going to start pouring it over. And then kind of, as soon as you feel comfortable with the weight, as soon as you feel like you have a nice thing going, start kind of jostling it. Raise it up a little bit. If you see a really nice little foamy looking, looks like the head on a beer forming, you know you're doing a great job. So that felt pretty good to me. If there's sludge or anything kind of hanging out, you can try to kind of hold back on it, or you can just dump it all in. It's either going to settle out here, or at the end of fermentation, it's going to settle out in the end of that bucket. You don't want it in your glass when you're drinking the beer, but it's not going to affect the flavor. You just want to kind of choose where you leave it behind. I tend to just dump everything over because I think focusing on getting oxygen mixed back in is what I would put my attention on at this point, basically. If you don't think you got a good splash, if you're not happy with your splash action, you can do it one more time. Just go back. And forth. And you can kind of hear it hissing, hopefully. That's another good sign that you're doing all the right things there. I'm happy with that. This is now ready to go. We'll grab our lid back out of here. Just kind of set it loosely on.
When did you put the yeast in?
Not yet. We're going to do that next. Fish my airlock out of here if I can find all the bits and pieces. There's a little line in the middle of your airlock usually. You want to just fill it up roughly to there, but just about halfway will work just fine. I'll get down in here. And then the final thing to do, at the beginning we said we're making 5 gallons of beer out of this thing. I don't know if you guys can see it, but right now we're kind of floating right on this 3-gallon mark. This is when we're basically going to get the volume that we want. It's just because it's kind of hard to, on your stovetop, boil that much liquid, and it would take literally probably forever, well, figuratively forever, for that stuff to come up to a boil. Working with kind of 3, making a slightly concentrated version, and then just diluting it up to 5 gallons inside of your fermenter doesn't affect the quality, and really just, I mean, makes it feasible to do. So, tap water, again, is going to be great for topping this thing up. Hopefully alarm bells are going off in your head about sanitation right now. The water coming out of your tap is potable and sanitary and good to use, or a lot of people will go wrong, and if there's a place where people usually do pick up contaminants, I would say it's during this part of the process. You want to make sure whatever vessel you use to take it from the tap to your bucket is also sanitary. This thing just came off a rolling boil, so this is about as good as it gets. If you want to slosh a little star sand down there, good on you. Pour that out, fill it up with a few more gallons of water, and then just top that bad boy up to 5 gallons. I just touched this, so if you're feeling extra anal.
Does the diluting of it affect the alcohol volume?
It'll basically give you the alcohol volume that you were looking for off your recipe. So if you didn't add any more water, there's only so much sugar that's inside of this like volume or whatever. So if we concentrate the volume, we're basically concentrating the sugar or the yeast food or the ABV. So you'd have less stronger beer, if that's grammatically correct or makes logical sense. You could over dilute it, and then you would have, more lower gravity or like lower strength, lower ABV, lower alcohol beer. Yeah, but 5 gallons is just kind of where they calculate it, so you get the alcohol that you're expecting. Yeah. Bring it up to 5, re-sanitize my lid, set it loosely on, and then grab my yeast. So the final step on brew day is to take your little package of yeast. The dry stuff is super easy. Shake it down. Sanitize next pair of scissors. Again, if you're going to choose to be anal about something. Snip it open. And then you don't have to really worry about mixing it in or nothing fancy. Just kind of like you're making bread is like the analogy I always use. Just sprinkle that yeast right on top.
Same spot, don't circle it around.
I just let them form a pile, and then they kind of do it on their own. Pretty quickly they'll just spread out. There's your blows. You just got your work turning into beer. Last thing to think about on brew day is essentially where you want to stash this. If sanitation is the #1 most important thing to get good results, I'd say the second most important thing to getting good beer out of this is where this guy hangs out during the 2 weeks that it's going to take to do his magic. Doesn't really matter what temperature, as long as you're in between 60 and 75 degrees. That's good. What you really want to pay attention to is basically finding a place that's temperature stable. So the worst place in the world I could possibly ferment a beer would be right in front of this window. In the middle of the night, it's freaking freezing, and then especially in the summertime, the sun's coming through. It's probably going back and forth 20, 30 degrees or something like that. So anywhere it's close to the thermostat. If you have a cellar in your house, that's a great place to do it, just because you have a heat sink of the earth, which is nice, which is why they used to ferment in caves.
Like a basement, or because I feel like my basement's usually just cooler than everything else. Kind of stays that way. That be a decent place?
Yeah, absolutely. As long as it's not maybe below 60 degrees or something. And if it is, there's a couple pretty easy hacks. Once these yeast start doing their thing, fermentation is an exothermic process, which basically means they're going to put off a little bit of heat. If you wrap a sleeping bag or a nice plush towel around there, you can basically retain that heat and pick up 10 degrees. And that tends to make it pretty consistent too, which is nice. So yeah, anywhere that's relatively temperature stable. Interior bathroom, in your tub, is a pretty good place. Or in a cellar. Or if you get we use this chest freezer that has a heat thing hooked up to it so it stays real consistent. But that's getting kind of fancy. Try to forget about it. That's the hardest step now. Don't rush it. Like if there's sanitation and then there's temperature control, the number 3 most important thing, maybe even tied with number 2, is just patience. As long as you start to see this thing doing its work inside of a couple days, and often even if you don't, it's more than likely doing its job. But those yeast will wake up over about the first 24 to 48 hours. They'll rehydrate. They'll kind of realize, guys, there's a whole bunch of food here. They'll eat up all the oxygen first, and they'll make more yeast cells. And then as soon as they run out of oxygen, or as soon as the environment becomes like anaerobic, basically, then they start eating sugar. They start fermenting your beer. So again, they're eating that nice little sugar molecule that we had, and just through their natural, metabolism or whatever, when you break apart this molecule inside of your gut, your little yeast gut or whatever, energy is produced that lets the yeast continue doing their thing, and then the byproduct will be an alcohol and a CO2 molecule. The alcohol kind of hangs out inside of here, and that's what makes the beer fun. The CO2 rises to the top, builds up pressure inside of your bucket. If this was just a plain old bucket, you'd be, nice and cozy in your bed like 2 days after fermentation. Then at like 4 in the morning you'd hear, and then you'd go and you'll hear it said that you're not really a home brewer until you've mopped your ceiling, which I've done that before too. But the bubbler here, the little hole that we've drilled in it with the airlock in it, lets that gas escape, keeps it protected from the outside environment. So this will do its thing. Those yeast will be eating up all that sugar. It'll really vary how long that process lasts. I'd say a good average is probably 3 to 7 days. There are things you can do to know that it's done, but especially for just getting going, I say just give it 2 weeks. And even this day, that's what I do with my beers. I give them 2 weeks. That way I know all the sugar's been fermented over into booze. And beyond that, it's had a little bit of time to let all the stuff settle out to the bottom and let a nice little layer of crud form down here with nice, beautiful beer sitting on top for me to put into bottles and then drink.
The longer you leave it, does the more alcohol content it get?
To a point. Basically, so what'll happen over those 2 weeks is they'll be eating, and going crazy, like making alcohol and CO2 as a byproduct or whatever, fermenting, in other words. At some point, they're going to run out of sugar. When they run out of sugar is basically when your beer's done. So after they've eaten up all the available food for them, that's kind of where your ABV will max out. So after about a week, they should probably pretty darn close to done. After 10 days to 2 weeks, they've basically eaten all the food that we've given to them. So you can let it sit longer, and kind of like a wine, that will help, especially in stronger, darker beers, that will help like flavors develop, and it'll kind of help smooth them out and help the beers mature, but you really won't get any more ABV after all the major food supply is gone, essentially. Yeah. Or the stuff that they can use to produce alcohol.
The more sugar you put in it, does that do anything either?
So the more, like during the brew process, so the more food that you give them, like, for this recipe that we used here, like a couple pounds of grain and then 2 cans of extract, that gives us about enough sugar for this to become 5.5-ish% alcohol. If I was to double the amount of sugar that I mixed in, if we did like 4 cans of this and like 4 pounds of grain, we could get a 10% or a 10.5 or 11 or 12% ABV beer. After you get above 12%, there's a host of other factors that kind of come into play that can make it hard, just because the alcohol eventually will start to kill the yeast. But yeah, you can basically kind of control your alcohol that you're looking for by how much sugar you add, during that brewing process. Yeah. We'll kind of move on to the final step now, which is putting it in bottles. Any other questions kind of on brew day? We're going to take another magical Food Network jump forward in time about 2 weeks right now. But that'll be basically the brew day. So
I have a silly question. If you were to put your fermenting beer in one place and then you had to move it, fine to slosh it around a little bit? Not slosh it out of the bucket, obviously.
So basically, that's actually a pretty pertinent question, because you'll have this maybe say down in your basement or whatever, and when it is time to get it ready to go into the bottles, you're going to basically be using gravity to take all the clear beer off the top down into a different container. That is going to require you to move it from wherever it's kind of hanging out to wherever it's going. So I'll go down to my basement after 2 weeks, I'll grab my brew bucket and I'll like try to be as careful as I can bringing it up the stairs. But inevitably, like I'm gonna disturb some of that crud and it's gonna get a little bit hazy or whatever. Give it at least like an hour, kind of sitting wherever it's gonna be. That should be plenty of time for any of that stuff to kind of settle back down and make a nice little compact yeast cake again. Or even better, like if you know you're gonna be bottling on Saturday, just go down Friday night, bring it up to your kitchen, and just like let it sit on your counter overnight, and then the next day, like you're beautiful, you're in really good shape.
So between time we pitched our yeast and bottling day, if we're dry hopping in this period, or we're adding a flavor like a fruit flavor into it, what process do we go to sanitize before going in there?
Sure. So if I was gonna like dry hop it or something, the easiest way to do it, just because like we said, the hops are naturally antimicrobial, like it's sterile inside of this package. Often when I'll dry hop beers, unless it's one of those New Englands where it's like so crazy I might want to bag it up or something, I'll just, like then sanitize some scissors or something. I'll just come down to my bucket, rip those hops open, dump them in. That's it. If I was going to do something more crazy, like put it on top of fruit or rack it onto some like wood chips to kind of age or something like that, then I would just grab what they call a secondary fermenter, which is basically just a second bucket or second whatever it's going to sit in. I would just follow the same procedure that we use to sterilize our bucket. Mix up a few gallons of that star sand. Make sure every surface gets a good minute or two of contact with that stuff. And the process that we're about to do, we're going to use the next tool, the auto siphon, to transfer it down into our bottling bucket. I would just transfer it into this instead. Let it sit for,
you wouldn't sanitize the wood chips or the fruit?
I usually will do that too. You want to sanitize pretty much everything. If it was wood chips, like I would probably just let them soak in some booze or something like that to sterilize. You can use either like chemical or heat. So you can put them in the oven. If it's like fruit, you can cook it a little bit, warm it up. Or there's like alcohol, which will do it. Or you can use a chemical called like potassium, like metabisulfite, or like a sorbate kind of thing, which we have all over on our little wine chemical shelf there, which also like neutralizes wild yeast and wild bacteria.
Then I was reading that if you, before bottling, if you chill the bucket, it helps settle
That's called cold crashing. So if you do have one that just doesn't want to like clear up for you or whatever, like leave it outside overnight on a night it's not going to get retardedly cold. That quick shock of temperature will basically, if there's anything floating in there, kind of force it to settle down to the bottom, which makes it easier to get clear beer off the top. Yeah.
I know you said the flavors that come are not necessarily that, like, it just tastes like that. But I mean, so when you add, like, if you were having a fruity beer, like,
you can add it at any point, and again, it's kind of like that's where it is nice. Like, my favorite part of this job is when people come in and are like, "Hey, I want to make like a beer that tastes like peaches and bubble gum or something," and then there's like 50 different strategies we could talk about. But it tends to be either like adding it right at the end of the boil, or with fruit, I think it's better to do what we just talked about. Cut up a bunch of nice peaches, maybe soak them in a little bit of like neutral grain alcohol or something to sterilize them. Dump that into this container that's also sterilized, rack the beer on top, and let them set for another 2 weeks before you move up to bottle it.
And everything, what makes it a beer like hazy? Like
a number of things. It can either be like those yeasts. Sometimes, like some beers are designed to have the yeast kind of stay in there. Again, Hefeweizen is a great example. If you like those hazy IPAs, those basically are using like grains that just leave a lot of crap behind. Yeah, a lot of protein and stuff like that. Or you can get hop haze or fruit haze too, just from like pectins or hop compounds that kind of just float around in the beer.
What about like when you're drinking a beer and it leaves? I can't remember the technical term for it, but like when you're drinking a Belgian and it gets that, what is it called? Like leaves the white part.
The head.
Yeah.
Or the lacing on the side of the glass or
Yeah.
something. And that's basically what we're going to talk about now is putting the beer into bottles. This beer is done. This beer is alcoholic and it's ready to start getting you drunk. But it is in a huge bucket. It is flat and it's room temperature. So the objective of putting it into bottles is to put it in a place where we can have it in a single serving size, to have it in a thing that's easy to get cold, but then in the bottle it's also going to carbonate. And basically what that means is CO2 is going to get dissolved into the beer, which will get released when we open up that beer bottle. And the action of that CO2 bubbling up out of the liquid is kind of what causes that little bubbly like head or foam on the beer to kind of stick around and be really nice and pretty while you're drinking it. So let's talk about bottling. I have no idea what time it is, you guys. Okay, this will take 10 minutes. We'll get you guys out of here. Next tool that we're going to use, and second to third to last tool, is our siphon. And basically all this thing is a big plastic tube with a stiffened end that is inside of a bigger plastic tube that has a valve in the bottom. So in other words, all this thing is a big pump. But the cool thing about a siphon is instead of having to use mechanical action to pump the beer, as long as we get this thing kind of started, I don't know if your Dad ever forced you to go to Walmart parking lot in the middle of the night and like suck gas out of an old Cadillac or something like that. It essentially works on it. It does work on that same principle. So instead of a gas tank of a Cadillac, again, hopefully alarm bells are going off in your head. Before this thing touches my beer, I'll have some sanitizer mixed up. Sanitizing your siphon is pretty easy. You can actually just pump it through there, which is nice. Flip it upside down to get her all nice and coated here. And then we're ready to rack. Another thing to kind of think about in advance of your bottling day is just to make sure you have enough bottles ready to go. Like we said at the beginning, this is going to turn into, about 2 cases of beer. So I would say have 2 cases on hand. Maybe have a 6-pack to drink while you're bottling, just in case you have a little bit of overflow. Any bottle that you use a beer opener, anything you need a pop top basically to open, is going to be able to get these caps put back on it. This is the next thing we'll be using, which also comes in your kit. That'll fit any kind of standard size bottle, which they pretty much all are, unless it's like some weird European beer.
John, when is the next class for someone to attend in person going to be?
We'll talk about that too, but we'll do another one next month, probably around the same time. And I think we'll diversify the topics. We used to always just do this class all the time. I think we'll do a Facebook poll, and if you guys want to hear about something else, yeast starters or secondary fermentation or kegging or whatever, we'll kind of leave that up to you all.
You can also use the pop top, like the
drawer style bottles. Those are awesome. I love those things.
Do you need to get a new seal every time?
Nah, just still get some sanitizer and you're good. So I've got all my bottles kind of standing by, ready to go.
Bottles are sanitized as well, I'm assuming?
Yeah, we'll do that right before we put the beer into them. It's only been, if I think the sanitizer's still good, if I still have it in my bottling bucket, I can use it to sterilize my bottling bucket. But if not, on bottling day, the first thing I'll do is just mix up some sanitizer in here, give this bottling bucket a little once around. I'll drain some through the spigot too, just to make sure the inside of that gets to get nice and sterile. And then I'll actually usually use my brew kettle, since I have it on hand, to hold the sanitizer that I'll need to get the rest of this going. So I always do this. If you're setting this thing on the ground, kind of a design flaw, but that spigot will hit the ground before the edge of the bucket. If that happens, even another little sanitizing thing there, just rotate it to the side. And I always do this, make sure this thing is closed when you start racking the beer into it. No matter how many times I double check myself. So I've got my sanitized siphon. And all there is to it is to put the tail end down into my bucket there.
Just to answer your question on here, Chris, we're thinking about doing some other different topics in our future classes, which this might be like a monthly thing, so maybe next month we could do an all grain, or in the coming months we'll have an all grain demo going on.
100%. All there is to it at this point is to just give this upper thing a couple quick pumps that draws liquid into the inside of the tube. When I push it down, it seals the valve on the bottom, forces it through the rest of the way. Once the beer here gets lower than the beer here, the gravity pulling on this matter will create a vacuum effect that basically draws more matter into the system, and the cycle continues until we run out of liquid up top. So it very gently allows us to suck all the nice stuff off the top of this bucket and avoid sucking up all the crud that's kind of hanging out down on the bottom. So it'll take a little bit of time, just kind of zen out, let it do its thing. And at some point, you are going to kind of get down so low in the pot that, you know, you might start to see, like, shouldn't be seeing these bubbles, but I'm kind of holding it at an awkward angle here. If you start to see any sediment or, like, gunk coming up, usually close to the bottom, you kind of get one good opportunity to kind of tilt it a little bit and just suck all the clear beer that you can off the top. It's your call when you decide to call it quits. I usually sacrifice a little bit of beer inside of my pot just to have clear beer going into my bottles. But whenever you're ready to stop, all you have to do is pull that end out. Let that drain down there. And then we're done with this guy.
Did you run it through a filter at this stage?
If you want to, but the gravity is usually sufficient. And filtering kind of can create its own set of complications. That's definitely something we can talk about in detail if it's like a problem for you, or if it's something you want to do.
I've just seen a lot of people talk about single-stage filters during racking.
Yeah, I think it's not really. I think the problems outweigh the benefits. We're about to use these tools. I'll talk about them in a second, but for now, toss them in my sanitizer. My beer comes up here, and next thing is to basically put it down into the bottles. We said a second ago that we're trying to produce carbonation inside of these bottles. The yeast that are still kind of hanging out in this beer, even though most of them have settled out, there's still some yeast guys hanging out in here. As we've seen during the 2 weeks of fermentation, yeast are great at producing CO2, provided they have sugar to eat. During these 2 weeks of fermentation, they've eaten all the sugar. They're out of food now. So if we want more CO2, we just need to give them a little bit more sugar, and they'll take care of that for us. In your recipe kit, you'll also get
1 second on these questions, guys. I'll ask them.
something called priming. We're almost done. We can hit those at the end. We'll do priming sugar, and all that is a super, super simple kind of corn sugar, which we're going to mix into our finished beer here. Really mix, stir well, distribute evenly, so that each bottle of beer that we fill up will have the same amount of this stuff. General rule of thumb for getting a beer to carbonate well, but not to produce so much gas that you get bottle bombs or you get explosions, is about 1 ounce per gallon. So these are pre-measured to 5 ounces. It's really, really easy. I'll just usually take a saucepan, a couple cups of water, dump the sugar in there, dissolve it, let it boil for a minute or two just to sterilize. Run some cold water around it in my sink. Again, you don't have to cool it down to 70, and it's just a couple cups of water. So 2 or 3 minutes is plenty of time to cool it down just kind of off of boil. I'll pour it over the surface of my beer. I'll take some kind of a nice spoon, sanitize it.
Don't put it down in the bottles, like the sugars.
You can dose each bottle, but it kind of gets tricky to make sure you get the same amount inside of each one. If you just mix it into the whole batch and mix it well, that way you know there's the same amount of sugar going inside of each bottle here.
So, John, David Woolums asked, could you pour the beer through a sanitized mesh strainer into the bottling bucket?
You could, but basically what you're going to do is potentially aerosolize it, diffuse it through that bag, and that could mix in oxygen that you don't want at this point. So if you wanted to do that, yes, but come in, we'll talk about strategies to basically make sure that you don't get it, that you don't do more harm than good.
Okay, and Glenn Arney asks, why do I get lots of tiny bubbles through my siphon tube when I'm racking?
Usually that's just because the vacuum effect, if you have a crack, if it's an old siphon or something, if there's a cracked seal somewhere, it can draw air into the system as well, which you also don't want to do, so you might maybe just invest in a new siphon. Might be the answer to that question.
Cool, thanks.
If you're going to stir this really well, just take 2 or 3 minutes to just gently mix it all around, get it nice and uniformly dissolved. When you're happy, grab all your beer bottles, and I'll usually do, I can't fit them all, obviously, 2 cases down into my sanitizer, but I'll do, if it's bombers, if it's big bottles, maybe 4 at a time. If it's 12-ounce bottles, maybe 6 or 8 at a time. Just let them all glug, and fill up with your sanitizer down here. I'll I'll have all my other ones kind of standing by over here, ready to go. I will grab all of my bottle caps, which will also come with your recipe kit. And I'll just dump all of them down in there to get nice and sanitized. And then the final step is to grab your tubing. The same one that came off of your siphon will be used for this step. This is your bottle filling wand, and essentially what we're going to do is hook one end of the tubing onto our bucket up here, which we can now rotate back down. We're going to fit the other end of the tubing over the end of our bottle filling wand. All that this bottle filling wand is again, just a big plastic straw. But at the end, there's this little nifty doohickey, which is essentially just a spring-loaded compression valve. You can see this little black tailpiece inside of here, maybe. This tailpiece butts up against the spring. The spring butts up against the underside of this plastic tube, and I push it in there. And so as long as this thing is like engaged, it's forcing that tailpiece down, which is basically like having my thumb over the end of this straw. So even if I open it up here, liquid's really not going to start to flow until I take my thumb off or until I depress the mechanism. But instead of using my finger to do that, we're going to use the bottom of the beer bottle. And I'll stick over here so it's easier to see. So this is full of sanitizer. If you're not using this thing, you can just kind of set it down in there, keep it nice and sanitary. Drain the liquid out. I'll line up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever I can fit. In the meantime, while I'm filling them up, I'll stick 6 more back in here to get sanitizing. And then all there is to it, again, instead of using my finger to get this flow started, put it down in there. If it's just sitting, nothing's going to happen until I just gently push down.
Why are you doing that, not doing it just directly from the spout?
Basically because this is super freaking messy. We used to have to use this thing. This is like the most genius, like $3 invention ever. Because this is such a non-drippy, like, easy off and on mechanism. And then the really nice thing about it is that if you like just let the bottles all fill all the way to the very, very, very tip top, all you have to do to stop the flow is just let go. And then they stop filling. And if you fill each one exactly to the top, because the straw will always be the same size, when you pull it out, it sinks back down. You get the exact same amount of beer in every single bottle without even having to try. And they scale the diameter of this thing so that when you do pull it out, it sinks down exactly 1.25 inches, which is like the ideal amount of headspace to get good carbonation inside of your beers. So whoever made this thing
helps to minimize aeration at that point as well.
Exactly, yeah.
Which is important.
So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm not using that guy. We'll toss it in there. Fish out the correct amount of bottle caps. And usually I'll kind of set one on each bottle. Then I'll grab the final tool of our brewing day here, or of a bottling day rather.
Are you going to sanitize that?
You really don't need to just because it's all kind of an isolated system, but I like the way you think, sister. Why not, right?
Never hurts.
Yeah, it never hurts. When in doubt,
And
trying to think
again,
of something that rhymes.
you're
but
not
stick it in
scared
there.
of like the excess water or anything like that.
Nope, not at all. In fact, it like makes me happy because I know that if it's there, like bacteria aren't. This just comes down here. It's a pretty simple action. You don't have to push down super hard. It's just trying to get leverage going out. Crimp it, and that's it. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These go off to the side or into a box or something like that. 6 more bottles come out here. 6 more go in here to sanitize. And then you basically just lather, rinse, and repeat until you run out of beer up top.
Are you putting your straw back into the sanitizer every time?
You don't really need to, but you're probably going to have your hands full doing other stuff, so that's just like a nice place to set it instead of like,
If your hands get full, you can just set that back in that bucket of sanitizer and know that it's going to be staying clean.
So I've got about 2 cases of beer bottled up, and the last thing we kind of have to do, in my opinion, this is actually the hardest part, and it's waiting for this thing to carbonate. We've done all that work, and you want to drink it so bad. Over about a week, basically those yeast will eat up this last teeny little bit of sugar that we've mixed in. They'll make their last few little futile farts before they go into deep hibernation. Those farts will collect inside of this bottle. Instead of bubbling up and out through that airlock like we saw during fermentation, that gas is going to build up in here. Eventually that gas is going to dissolve into the beer. Get one cold after, a week, stick it in the fridge overnight. Don't get it cold until you want to drink it wherever your beer was hanging out at that room temperature spot that's pretty stable. That's where these guys are going to want to hang out while they carb up. So leave them at room temperature. Get them cold when you're ready to try one after a week or so. And then hopefully when you open it, if you hear that, beautiful. If it's kind of weak or if you don't hear it, just give it another 5 days. Try one again. Very rarely does it take more than 2 weeks for things to carb up nicely.
If you don't hear that, do you cap it again and put it back in there, or releasing that will it just?
Yeah, once you crack it, you kind of just enjoy some nice
flat beer,
cask style. Yeah. Yeah, and then hopefully you got something nice and carbonated and alcoholic and, depending on the recipe, malty or hoppy or whatever your taste buds like. They'll be ready in about 2 weeks, but beer ages really, really well, kind of like we were saying a little bit ago. You'll also hear it said that the best beer you have out of any batch that you make will be the last one that you drink. With the exception of a very few styles, beer ages great. So, drink one at, 3 weeks as soon as it's carved and try it. One of my favorite things to see it, how they develop and age and mature and all that kind of stuff just as they get a little bit older and further on. I just talked a fuckload about it. Great questions, you guys. This is a bigger class than we normally get, so it did take a little longer. I apologize for your time there, but hopefully that make it seem easier rather than harder, and just kind of make it seem more doable. Our little instruction sheet that we give out, this comes with every recipe that we do. Our phone number is right on the top here, and I'm actually amazed I haven't gotten called during class. Oh, it's because you have my phone.
I'm amazed we haven't gotten a call this whole time. How old is too old?
If you have questions, we sell all the stuff and we help people do custom recipes, but the thing that we really try to specialize in is product support, basically. So if you have questions or something doesn't make sense, there's no dumb questions. You can even shoot me a text or send me a message on Facebook or something, so we try to be there for you on the fly.
Someone online asks, how old is too old? I guess they were talking about conditioned beer, bottle conditioned beer.
I was going to take that in another direction.
Yeah.
I have some in my basement that are 12 years old. Big old Scotch ales or big old barley wines.
Depends on the style a lot.
Depends on the style, yeah. IPAs are best, usually inside of 3, 4, 5, 6 months. Wheat beers don't go bad, but I think wheat beers tend to taste better when they're fresh. Everything else, sometimes porters and stouts, I'll let them get 4 or 5 months old before I really even start digging into them too much, just because they get really good. Big barley wines, big stouts. Sometimes you'll even intentionally age those for a year before you even start cracking them. So it really depends on the style, but it's never going to go horribly rancid or turn into something that'll kill you, assuming your sanitation and stuff like that was on point.
Cool.
Any other questions, guys? Thank you all so much for coming and hanging out with us here. If anybody needs anything, we're certainly still open. If anybody has any general questions, holler at me now, but I'm here and I'm hanging out.
Age in the bottles themselves?
Yeah, you'll hear it called bottle conditioning, but you can leave it in a carboy for longer if you want to let it, if you know you're not going to be doing anything with it for a while, or you can go ahead and bottle it. It'll age great either way. Yeah. But thank you guys so much. I'm here. Come with me. Specific questions. If anybody needs anything, holler, but really, really can't thank you all enough, and hope it was worth a little bit longer time here.
So, what are the price ranges of the different beer kits?
For sure, great question. So all the equipment that we use is in our basic fermentation kit, which is $65. Thanks a lot, you guys.
Yeah, appreciate you.
Recipe kits tend to range from $30, $35 for lighter beers, all the way up to $40 to $45 is probably a good average.
So all together.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you. About $100. Yeah.
That's not bad.
Yeah, and then after you got
Especially
the
once you,
equipment.
yeah, you got the equipment, that's the biggest shit. Oh, yeah.
Are you still going?
Yep.
I will say, for anybody who didn't get to make it out, for basically the rest of the month here, we'll have 10% off of any of our starter stuff or anything like that. So come in and just use the magic word Facebook and we'll knock 10% off. Just basically tell us you saw the class.
Ricky asks, what's your favorite beer-related YouTube channel other than Boy Meets Wort?
Man,
Also, hashtag BrewBuds for life.
Hey, Ricky. The Ricky's Mom channel.
Okay.
Do you have any YouTube videos?
We do, yeah. We have a YouTube channel that we do. We're making a big, like, explanatory series right now, but we also just do it kind of as a fun, goofing around on beer thing. It's called Boy Meets Warhol.
Thanks, guys. It was fun. See ya.
Thanks, guys.
Oh, you know what? I saw that.